Basically, the Code of Hammurabi is really interesting because people want to know, well, how did things become the way they are? Where did laws come from? Where did the structure to everything come from? Was it just a bunch of people over time developed it and then here we are and it's all part of this natural cycle that just occurs? Or is there a lot more to it? And when you read the Code of Hammurabi, you really get an understanding of that. So what the Code of Hammurabi is, it's actually the largest cuneiform writing tablet in the world. It's a massive, tall, single stone that they carved all of this writing into. And it basically, Hammurabi was one of the later kings of Babylon. So Babylon was one of these empires in Mesopotamia that was constantly fighting with its neighbor, Nineveh, to the north. And they both had different gods and deities that were represented by them. Babylon's god was Marduk, what Hammurabi talks about as how he was given divine rulership by some of these names we're going to go over, some of these beings that have identified themselves as gods. He distinctly says that, they picked him, Hammurabi, to be, this shepherder of mankind, following through, handing down all these different laws and rules that he would use to govern the people. And so when we read all about those, we see where this entire structure came from, and we can see that it's by no means an accident. And the entire fabric of our society, when you look at how things are organized, what people believe in, what they're focused on doing, and what they're governed by, we can trace it back to the very beginning, because that really brings up the big question: is, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing right now? These kings, these bloodline ruler ancestors that were chosen, and that's the word I really want to emphasize, these chosen bloodlines ancestors, they had to keep carrying down these rules and laws so that society would follow them very closely, to keep order, to keep control and order within our society. I wanted to go over some tablets that I've really never talked about. We're gonna do 2 readings today of tablets that I've never done a reading for or really talked about that much, because the bottom line is this: so many of the secrets of the past are found in these cuneiform tablets. That means these etched in writing of they essentially took clay and they heated it so that it would turn hard and last essentially for thousands and thousands of years. And by doing that, they could create this form of writing within the clay or sometimes rock that would essentially not erode ever, or for a very, very long period of time, so that they could have a message be protected. The idea that there were these megalithic advanced human civilizations that once existed all around the planet. And today, all we have are these small remnants of those that are left. But more importantly, what we find is this continuation of building by their ancestors later that tried to accomplish what they did, but they weren't able to because they didn't have the understanding and the knowledge. And so what we're about to read here in a second is that that knowledge and that information so that they knew how to do those types of buildings, how to create this type of kingship model so that they could structure society and create empires and great civilizations. How do you do that? Is that just something that, someone comes up with and is like, hey, this is a good idea how to do this? Or is it, more importantly, is it a very strict set of commands and rules that get re-lored over and over again? And that's what you see when you read things like the Sumerian king list and what we're about to read in a second. You see this over and over and over again. They have to keep lowering kingship into different civilizations because they're destroyed through things like war or cataclysms or whatever occurs, and they have to keep reestablishing this model on Earth. So the tablet that I'm going to start with, that a lot of people might not have heard of, but I highly recommend it, is called the Epic of Eridu tablet. Okay, so Eridu was considered in Mesopotamia. And we're talking about a timeline that's, according to the Sumerian king list, is over 200,000 years ago. Okay, so we're throwing the timeline of human civilizations. So the Epic of Eridu tablet talks about how the first city on Earth where kingship was lowered and civilization arose from, when the royal scepter was coming down from heaven, The august crown and the royal throne being already down from heaven, the king regularly performed to perfection the august divine services and offices, and laid the bricks of those cities in pure spots. They named by name and allotted half-bushel baskets. The firstling of the cities, Eridu, she gave to the leader Nunamud. The second, Bad Tabira, she gave to the prince and sacred one. The third, Lacroix, she gave to Palisog. The fourth, Sipar, she gave to the gallant Utu. The fifth, Sharupak, she gave to Ansud. On Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had the gods of heaven and earth swear by the names of On and Enlil. When you read those names, those cities that I just mentioned, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lacroix, Sipar, Sharupak, all those terms are found in other tablets as well, talking about these cities that are they're almost not even there anymore. There's such a small amount that remains from this time period that if you were to go out in the desert of Iraq, down in the Fertile Crescent today, some of these remote areas that not many people go to, you can still find Eridu today. You could still find these remnants out in the desert in the sand of this massive complex that was just there, that all it's left now is just windswept sand over this what looks like what was this huge massive structure. And what's amazing is we look around today at, you know, the fact that we have we have cell phones and technology, TVs and all this wireless and all these things around us. But yet, in many ways, we're less sophisticated than these global civilizations that used to exist are. Not in terms of technology like phones or something like that. This materialistic technology. Their technology was more of an understanding and a wise technology of understanding the electromagnetic grid of our entire earth, where all these ley line convergence zones were to build these megalithic temples and these pyramids all around the world. They understood sophisticating building techniques for how to create these massive, perfectly symmetrical and precise walls in places like, if you go down to Tiwanaku and Machu Picchu and Cusco, we can see evidence of these civilizations that were once there that were then destroyed and by cataclysms. And we're gonna read through some of these tablets that discuss some of those cataclysms that occurred. Just like we have today, certain words can mean more than one thing. And so if someone's trying to figure out what language and understanding that some other ancient civilization had from long ago, it's very, very easy to misinterpret what they were trying to say, because they often wrote and expressed themselves in a much, much more advanced, wise way than we do today. They had connections to information that was much more widely distributed until some of these disasters occurred. And then after this reset button occurred, which you can talk about, a lot of this became lost, but it didn't all become lost. And that's what the Druids represent, and what we're going to go into is that there was information and knowledge that was still carried on by certain civilizations that were passed down to some of these practicing, you could call them pagan societies that didn't follow modern Christianity or this monotheistic singular God aspect. In the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, these ancient records from Atlantis that he wrote, essentially, right? And then he hid inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, which were then moved later on to Mexico. But what it says in those, he writes about how there were these beings that were pretending to be people, hiding amongst mankind in the shadows, and he called them serpent-headed when their glamour is lifted. Okay, and that representation, as well as there's an Iraqi artifact that looks like this reptilian, scary-looking alien type of thing from Iraq, but it's not actually a reptilian; it's a serpent. Again, a serpent is a reptile. So that's where this comes into play. It's serpent-headed. What does that mean? Well, just like we're going to read later, they specifically mention how they called some of these ordainers of kingship, like Hammurabi, they were the shepherds of the black-headed people. Does that mean they're black? No, they're black-headed. Just like we see in all these depictions from Egypt of these bird heads and everything. It's what their mind, what was inside their head, what they were represented by. So what would black-headed be? It'd be someone who's completely ignorant and has no knowledge. It's just black, it's empty. That's what those representations were. They were shepherds to the culture, the citizens who were essentially had no knowledge. There was no computers back then. They had no way of learning any of this stuff unless they somehow were royal or had connections to some of these libraries and access to a lot of this information. But back then, they had almost no information. Serpent-headed, what does that mean? Well, it means wise and very knowledgeable. So just like you have a society where all these black-headed people, these ignorant people without knowledge are walking around, meanwhile, hidden among them are these what seem like people, but they're actually not really people. They're more like an incarnation of maybe another being that's very, very powerful and wise and has an understanding that none of the other people do. The serpent and the dragon have been this demonized evil thing all throughout, whereas the eagle has been this symbol of freedom and sovereignty, but it's completely the opposite. And you can see evidence for that all throughout history until this emergence of, the Holy Roman Empire, when religion became very corrupted, and it was a lot of these terms, heaven, hell, the eagle, the serpent, they were all turned into their backwards meanings and inverted, and everything became all confused. And before we knew it, things like the symbol of the serpent and the dragon became associated with evil, when they're actually represent knowledge, balance, and essentially creative higher consciousness. The Druids represented one of the last societies on the planet that still practiced the ancient Egyptian and Gnostic wisdom, which connected all the way back to Atlantis, and the idea of understanding consciousness and the universe around you, and that the physical body is just an avatar for your consciousness and spirit. And so they were practicing all of that knowledge still. At the same time, the Romans were becoming extremely powerful and influential, the Holy Roman Empire. And St. Patrick's father was a Roman himself. So St. Patrick was tasked by the church. Of course, the word saint should be used very loosely in this case. So St. Patrick was tasked to go to Ireland, Scotland, and England, and Wales, and rid all the serpents from that area. And of course, like you said, there's never been any snakes that live there. This is just a way to symbolically demonize them, even though that term is a term of endearment if you actually know what it really means. Serpent, it means wise and knowledgeable. There are a lot of indications if you read, there's a lot of writings that talk about this extensive underground network that exists all throughout the world, but not like we think. I don't think the earth is hollow, but I do think that they've cleared out very large areas and they've gone down and they exist in addition in non-physical forms in what's called the underworld. The North and South Pole is very interesting, and the whole underground thing is connected to the idea where how would you be able to control something like the electromagnetic energy of our planet, or control where some of the idea of a pole shift occurring, or where the energy centers are. The North and South Pole, where a lot of this no-fly zone, strange things like when Admiral Byrd flew over the North Pole and then spoke about how there was a strange entrance that he saw, and then all that information that led to that suppression of that information. What essentially has been happening is there's a lot of things behind closed doors that society just never gets to see. Things down in Antarctica, things in the North Pole, connected all the way back to ancient technologies and some of these secret societies. We're basically living in a reality that if people knew the truth about some of these things, it would almost seem like something right out of science fiction. There's a long, much older history than we realize here, with advanced civilization, or civilizations that came here long ago and imparted all of this knowledge that came from heaven down to earth. And of course, the term heaven and hell became a very confused term within religion, but really it breaks down to something like hell is equated to the underworld. There's an obsession about balance here. It's always about balance of energy. As above, so below. That essentially explains everything. If you have and there is evil that exists in the lower dimensions that's down there that is held back by some of those who protect it, they say. But if you do have that, then you also need benevolent forces down there, beings that can balance that. The same thing is true for the higher dimensions. You can have evil that exists there, but it also has to be balanced by good. So there's different beings that essentially were able to conquer these laws of reality, and were able to take on these different roles in these different places to manipulate reality, to create whatever reality they wanted to, and to also be able to control and harness energy, free energy, like Nikola Tesla figured out, which is essentially exactly the same thing about all these ancient pyramids all over the planet on these ley lines. It's always about energy, because energy is essentially what is the driving force behind everything. It's what continues something living without dying through entropy. These beings that came here long ago, they call themselves the Anuna, and they took over a lot of these roles within our reality and within religion, becoming essentially like angels and demons. But at the same time, there are other beings, other sentient beings that are in the universe as well, because we're talking about such a vast amount of space and planets and life that exists. It can't help but just create sentient life, because if you think about it, the intelligent design that's behind everything in the universe is a design that forces this combination of nature coming together with this intelligence that exists already, this conscious intelligence that exists everywhere, to create the environment where life just can't help but come to be. Yeah, they call themselves the Anuna. Right. The Sumerians call them as a third person. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, which meant those from Anu who sent from heaven to earth, or those from heaven to earth came, essentially. But they call themselves the Anuna. That's their actual name, and I believe that they're a combination of, like, when you look at something like the story of the Dogon with the Nomo, and how they talk so much about how they came from Sirius. And you look at the Nomo and the connections that the fish suit has back to Enki, and some of these beings that are part of this different time period of Pisces and represented through fresh water. You see that, oh, okay, well, that Oannes is Enki, okay, and that's the Nomo. That's the same thing. And also looking at the pyramids, how they're aligned to these different Sirius and Orion, it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking that however they got here, maybe it must have been through some kind of a wormhole or a Stargate, because I think linear travel from a place like Sirius or Orion would essentially be impossible. We're talking about distances that are so enormous that we have to get past a linear mindset and look more into, well, these are advanced beings that learned how to conquer reality itself. If you look into the records, especially something like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he talks about how during the time of Atlantis, before 10,000 years ago, there were, these global civilizations that were extremely advanced, advanced in terms of understanding energy and having pyramids and temples all around the world that had certain kind of rock that was quartz rich so that it could resonance with a high vibrational frequency, so they could reach these incredible states of consciousness. Because what I believe, based on what I've looked at, is that the Anuna originally were physical beings. That's why they have to have the Ajiji do, and we're going to read about that as we go on, have the Ajiji do all the physical labor for them. They're like demigods of them. But over time, they learned how to conquer the rules of reality, and they became non-physical in terms of being able to be interdimensional. They could go between different dimensions and influence so many different aspects of our reality. But at the same time, the Ajiji remained essentially as watchers of our world. And I believe that they're the ones that are probably most connected to what we think of as UFOs. They're tasked as watching and monitoring everything that's going on here, because the Anuna actually became separated by time and how we view it. And so time for them became much different than us. So essentially Gigi's purpose is to watch us. So getting back to that, Atlantis was a place where these different temples were erected and they could actually communicate with these gods. That's essentially what these temples were. they were temples that were created and this massive energy grid all over the planet. They could essentially communicate with these beings, and they could reach the highest states of consciousness to become like almost like gods themselves. And it was all this bizarre stuff that we would consider science fiction today, where they actually learned alchemy. I call it alchemy magic, because it really is beyond what is called sleight of hand magic, and it really is like an aspect of manipulating the reality around you, and that became lost over time. Some of these wars that were occurring were very real, because when Atlantis was destroyed, what you had was this struggle for power after. Okay, Atlantis was destroyed through a combination of their own, like I said, their own technology and manipulation, but along with some of these devastating events that were occurring on the Earth at the time, which was around the last ice age. But after that happened, there was an attempt to restart a lot of these civilizations around the planet, while at the same time, great empires were rising up, because they were in a different zodiacal time period, and they were all fighting for control. So I think there was two things going on. There were actual physical wars being fought between the civilizations on the planet that were essentially being ruled through different gods for supremacy. They were all just fighting each other, okay? And that's one of the reasons why I think kingship also kept having to be moved, because I think some of these places were just completely destroyed or taken over, and then that kingship model, that control of governing, was lost, so they had to relower it again, because they kept trying to create this perfect world, while at the same time, this control over our reality here, creating a false paradigm, keeping the human race enslaved in this lower vibrational energy through war. When you read about ancient people like the Hopi or the Maya, they talk about the Pleiadians. They talk about the Seven Sisters, and how there were other beings that were involved as well in our timeline, trying to at the same time help humanity and break us out of this illusion here, and help educate us and enlighten us. And they maybe even been involved with some of the seeding that occurred here long ago. But the point is, they were essentially, in some ways, in this war in heaven, this higher dimensional war with what the Anuna were doing to humanity, keeping us enslaved here essentially. But essentially the war in heaven was this war of these different beings who kept fighting over wanting our future to go a certain way. And so as above, so below was represented in the physical realm of Earth, with all of this war and chaos that was occurring here, with civilizations all fighting here, because it was like chaos in the heavens and the underworld. So it was reflected here on the planet, and that's still happening right now. If you look at places like Libya, you can see some of this this glass that's been formed from some incredible amount of heat that occurred out there. Some of these ancient cuneiform stories talk about how there were these devastating wars. What does that mean? Could there have been ancient nuclear technology used? Very possibly. We don't even know the extent of how bad the destruction was, but you could see how if they were fighting and using, and there was advanced technologies that, only came to be much later on, like some kind of a nuclear weapon, you could see how something like that could totally wipe out an entire city, and they would have to lower kingship again and restart over in another place. And after the reset occurred, I think they took a much less of a role, and in many ways maybe even left. And so humanity sort of had these temporary rulers through these secret societies and elite families, who then perpetuated this same model of war and chaos right up until today. And I think that's why you see families like the Rothschilds that are so connected to these bizarre quotes, like saying, if my sons didn't want war, there would simply be none. Quotes like that are so scary and bizarre, and they show us that all of these terrible events that are occurring here are actually manipulated and created to try to steer things in a certain direction or keep us in a certain state. So yeah, we have this long history of destruction that may go far beyond what we can even imagine, especially if you look at a place like Mars and another planet nearby, where radioactive isotopes have been found all over the planet, like covering the entire planet. And there was this sudden, massive event that occurred there where the entire atmosphere was blown out and all the liquid water evaporated into space, and it destroyed this whole planet. Was that remnant of ancient nuclear weapons? There's a lot of people and whistleblowers that have come out and said during things like the Cold War and during these really, really tense times when the United States or Russia or whatever location may have wanted to or even did try to launch nuclear weapons against the other country, and then something strange occurred where the button wouldn't work or became disconnected and there was no signal, and they literally couldn't launch these weapons of mass destruction that would have led to, this drawn out war that could have, cost billions of lives and been much more destructive than people realize. That's showing you that there are other forces involved here beyond what we see and what we know, who are trying to help guide us so we don't destroy ourselves and end up as another reset that has to start over again from the very beginning. I'd like to read a tablet that talks about that destruction that occurred here and this reset that happened, because essentially you had, when I mentioned, you had a situation where advanced technology was all over the planet, these global civilizations. There was these giants that were the ancestral remnants of the Anunnaki through crossbreeding that were like abominations on the earth. There was all this unbalance. And so what did they do? Well, they decided to just reset the entire human civilization and start over again. Era is connected to this god named Nergal, who is a god of the underworld, who essentially allows chaos into our realm. He's the guardian gatekeeper of that. And it's tablet 1 states, and again, you'll see a lot of these names that we've been talking about right in here. It says, the Anuna gods cannot fall asleep for the clamor of humankind. Beasts are overrunning the meadows, life of the land. And when it mentions clamor, it's talking about how we used to have this one language connecting all around the world. And that's why the Tower of Babel is this symbolic representation of when humanity was all divided and languages were all created and we all became a divided race rather than one unified race, okay? O King of all inhabited lands, creator of the world, holder of a sublime scepter, herdsman of the black-headed folk, shepherd of mankind. Lord Era, why have you plotted evil against the gods, to lay waste to the lands and decimate the people? Era made ready to speak and said to Isham, his vanguard, keep quiet, Isham. Listen to what I say as concerns the people of the inhabited world whom you would spare. O vanguard of the gods, wise Isham, whose counsel is always for the best. I am the king of the land. I am the fiercest among the gods. I am warrior among the Ajiji gods, mighty one among the Anuna. I will make Marduk angry, stir him from his dwelling and lay waste to the people. The warrior Era set out for Babylon, city of the king of the gods. He entered Isalia, palace of heaven and earth, and stood before him. He made ready to speak, saying to the king of the gods, why has your precious image, symbol of your lordship, lost its brilliance? The king of the gods, Marduk, made ready to speak, saying to Era these words, O warrior Era, concerning that deed you said you would do. Once long ago, indeed, I grew angry. Indeed, I left my dwelling and caused the deluge. When I left my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth disintegrated. When Marduk heard this, he made ready to speak, saying to the warrior Era, when I rise from my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth will disintegrate. The waters will rise and sweep over the land. Bright day will turn to darkness. Whirlwind will rise and the stars of heaven will be in chaos. Demons will raise up and seize the land. The gods of hell will rise up and smite down living creatures. Who will keep them at bay till I gird on my weaponry once more? When Era heard this, he made himself ready to speak, saying to noble Marduk, O noble Marduk, when you enter the house, fire cleanses your apparel and you return to your palace. For that time I will govern and keep strong the regulation of heaven and earth. I will go up to heaven and issue instructions to the Ajiji gods. I will go down to the depths and keep the Anuna gods in order. What that is essentially talking about is how they created this destruction on the planet to wipe away all of humanity, to then allow in this agreement so Marduk could rise to become this king of the Anunnaki here on Earth, which was why Babylon grew to become such an important place in the world, because Marduk was their chief deity. Okay, and Babylon is a city that spans the pre-Diluvian and continues into the post-Diluvian. That means that Babylon itself is an ancient city that's far older than we know. And a lot of these cultures after the cataclysms had to come back in and rebuild them again. In the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the chapter called the Hypothesis of the Archons, which means the rulers, it directly calls them the rulers of our reality, the rulers of the demiurge, meaning they understand that there's a primitive side of the human race that can be essentially perpetuated and controlled to keep us in a lower state. The demiurge represents our lower state, things like war, chaos, material greed, lust, all of these primitive urges that can be perpetuated to keep people in a lower state, because they'll never be able to reach a higher state, like we talked about, unlocking chakras and reaching higher states of consciousness, if they're being ruled by their demiurges of fear and war and chaos and keeping them in this lower state. And that's the whole game here. And I want to bring something up really important right now. When you look at these depictions, like we talked about, this headed aspect, serpent-headed, black-headed. Well, what about these depictions of these Anunnaki in murals all over the world where they have an eagle head, and they're passing along with a pineal gland in their hand with a handbasket? Well, let's go over what that means. Some of them had serpent heads, some of them had eagle heads, and what that essentially meant was, what kind of knowledge were they passing on? The eagle represents essentially the demiurge, war, control, and the material world. So you would essentially be teaching how to create these empires and civilizations based on certain kinds of laws to keep control. That's why they were represented through an eagle head. They were still passing along knowledge, creating powerful armies and controlled, organized civilizations. But at the same time, that's not a type of knowledge that can lead to balance, right? It's a type of knowledge that can lead to unbalance and keeping society in a place that doesn't allow them to reach a higher state, but more traps them. They rule their societies through fear and through keeping them entertained, but not entertained in a way where they would learn something and better themselves. They kept them entertained through violence. It's a war on consciousness, and it's a war on which direction our civilization will go. You know, that's why the eagle and serpent is this battle back and forth. You see so many depictions. Look at the flag of Mexico. It's this eagle holding the serpent. It represents this war of these two sides of, you could call it like almost like the yin and yang of our consciousness. It's the two sides of us. Which way will we go? Are we going to be, like I said, this having our demiurge control us and being controlled through war and conquering? Or are we going to become wise and knowledgeable and balanced and use our creative energy to try to increase our understanding of reality and become a sophisticated civilization? Those two sides were what was the war was about. That's what the war in heaven was essentially about. I wanted to bring up another tablet that explains all of this essentially, okay? And I've read it before, but I want to read this part again because it's very important, okay? It's very important to understand how we ended up at where we are today. And that is the tablet 2 of the Atrahasis. It's probably my favorite piece of cuneiform text of all, because what it says is it gives us clues to really what happened and how all this ended up the way it was. And on tablet 2, part of it says, and I'm paraphrasing because I'm jumping in here because it's a very long tablet, but essentially it says, "Where you went, Enki, you were to undo the chain and set us free. You were in charge of control and holding the balance, but instead you gave wisdom and knowledge to the people. Your creations have become too numerous and despoiled the earth. You imposed your loads on man. You bestowed noise on mankind, language, intelligence, and knowledge. You slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. Let us make far-sighted Enki swear an oath to the end. to create a flood on Earth to wipe away all of life. That's an amazing thing, not only because they're talking about these cataclysms, which I want to talk about really briefly because it's very important, but it talks about this phrase, undo the chain to set us free. All right, now think about that for a minute. If these are physical beings that came here, and they were physical at first, this chain represented them conquering the laws of reality to become non-physical, essentially losing this binding of having to be a physical being that dies and then has to incarnate over again. They essentially conquered those laws, and that's how they were able to conquer our reality. That's what that means. And they reset the entire civilization that was here because it become out of control. It'd become unbalanced and out of control, and so they wanted to create it over again. But the problem was, after they created civilization again, after this destruction occurred, which I was reading about in the Era Epic, after they had created it over again, it ended up becoming far more unbalanced and controlled than ever before. So what was supposed to be something that was benevolent and was supposed to be good to help the human race ended up being a means which forced us into even more control than ever before. And that's why we lost so much of what we used to have. And what I mean by lost, we're talking about these global civilizations that go from Easter Island up to the Inca of Peru and over in Tiahuanacan in Bolivia, right up through the Aztec and the Maya, up through the Americas, all over to places like around the Mediterranean and in Baalbek, Lebanon, and right down through Egypt, along the Nile, and over into Mesopotamia, over into India, right up through Western Turkey, up into Western Russia. This is a massive part of our world who used to have ancient civilizations, like I said, well over 10,000 years ago, that existed all around the planet, that had completely different knowledge and understanding than we did, that were connected to these gods, that were these sages and priests would go to these temples and would connect to them and then would guide the people. So then what happened, like you said, things became extremely unbalanced. The people became very, very wise and knowledgeable, and they ended up using that to their advantage and became powerful, and things got haywire here. And that's what I was talking about with Atlantis. So essentially what they did is they allowed this, or even created this series of cataclysms to essentially wipe everything away and start over. And they were able to do that through the combination of what looks like allowing or timing this comet to hit the northern ice caps, because this was during the last ice age. At the same time, we had what looks like poles shifting and the electromagnetic grid of the Earth completely becoming disrupted. So over the course of 800 to maybe more than 1,000 years, there were like these back-to-back disasters that occurred. It wasn't just one disaster. It would be a disaster like the comet hitting the ice caps and having them create a massive flood that led to the extinction of a lot of the megafauna in the Americas, like the woolly mammoth and the dire wolf. And so we had this episode where massive floods, things like enormous earthquakes and tsunamis that split open the earth in places and disrupted even some of the land masses. And at the same time, the climate was rapidly shifting, and you had these wildfires that were tearing apart around the globe. That's why when you go to places like Peru and you go to Egypt, you see this scarring and this burning on these monoliths, on these ancient carved stones, which were part of these building practices. You see this scarring that occurred from the combination of this destructive solar activity, because the electromagnetic grid had been disrupted. So all this incoming solar radiation could just pummel the planet, creating wildfires, and the climate was shifting. So what happened? Like Graham Hancock talks about recently, he's done some new interviews that are pretty spot on, I agree with. If you have a sophisticated, advanced civilization that becomes comfortable with its own technology like we are today, they lose sight of how to be this nomadic aspect where they can survive in the wild. Like, we could never survive in the wild today. We don't have those skills anymore. So what happened? These cataclysms, or numerous cataclysms, come through. These changes all around the world take place that are so violent that these sophisticated, advanced human civilizations were wiped out. And there were remnants of them that were still around, but the majority of them were wiped out. And what you had left were, at the same time, these coexisting nomadic, more indigenous people were on the planet, and they were the ones that had to then carry on the legacy. But they only had small connections to whoever had survived. And over time, each generation went by, these more primitive people who I believe who tried to rebuild things like Machu Picchu on top of these ancient structures. Even in places like the Maya and Aztec, you see that, but they just didn't have that information and knowledge. And so they started worshiping what they thought were these ancient gods from long ago, but they no longer had connections to them anymore. That's why they started becoming so focused and corrupted through blood sacrifice, and then identifying certain gods with things like the forces of nature and storms and things like that. So people see things like that and say, oh, this is a sun god or a storm god. That's because over time, all of this information was being lost and confused, and they started just trying to worship everything that they thought were these gods, when in reality, some of them were just the forces of nature. Don't confuse those two things. They're interchanged. Whereas you see something like Enki is directly speaking to someone like Ziusudra Adrahasis, giving him direct commands. Clearly, that's not just some force of nature doing that, because he's giving him direct commands and information about things that were about to happen and how to survive. Okay, and that's what that story is all about. Adrahasis Ziusudra, he was called. Also, he was Noah, and he was essentially one of the only ones who survived some of these cataclysms because he was warned, because he was an ancient ancestor of Enki, and Enki wanted to protect that certain bloodline so it could continue long into the future. That's why we have so much confusion on this, on what's occurred here, because we have these different epics of humanity, these epics that have occurred, and the rise and fall of technologies. And after these happened, you had an attempt to reestablish them in places like Göbekli Tepe, but it was for nothing, because this time period featured multiple different time periods of destruction, and they were wiped out. So the reset occurred on multiple levels, and what we're left with today, to make a long story short, is what we're left with today are just these remnants and pieces that are left. That's it.